How are you?
I'm excellent. It's great to talk with
Good.
you.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you for your interest in my work.
Your artwork truly beguiles me, and I think to engage with art on such a deep level is a really powerful and human experience. So for you to have provided that for me makes me feel a certain appreciation and admiration for you. So this is very exciting.
Well, thank you. I've been doing it a long time now.
How long?
Well, I've been showing, my first show in New York was in 1983.
So for those who don't know, Frederick Brosen is a painter, a watercolor painter, and your subjects are primarily cityscapes and
Hmm.
parks and architecture,
Hmm.
and primarily New York City. I mean, you've painted extensively in Europe and Paris and Italy as well. But
Hmm.
New York City of course, has a very special place in your heart, right? You were born and raised here.
I was born and raised in Manhattan. You know, it was funny when I went to Pratt Graduate School. I think I was the only born and bred New Yorker in the program. Everybody came from somewhere else to go to Pratt. So, people were amazed. They couldn't imagine. They said, "You spent your childhood here?" And I said, "Yeah, I grew up here." Actually, art is always really fascinating in retrospect. There's always, whenever you see a really evolved artist's work, there's always a great story behind it as to what led that artist to make that particular kind of work. In other words, art makes great sense in retrospect. People come to me and say, why do you do these elaborate, detailed, painstaking views of cityscapes? What is it? What's in it for you? Why this? Why of everything you could paint, of every approach you could take? Why is this the thing that you've evolved your art into? So that's always a question I ask artists. I'm always fascinated when I see really good work. I want to know where it came from. I want to know what the original motivations were, what the connections are. And it's always surprising. It always makes sense, but it's always surprising. So for me, I grew up on the Upper West Side, and my father was in real estate, but unfortunately got sick very early in his life, never made much money. But he was a kid of the Depression, never got out of high school, but was one of the best read people I ever met. He had read extensively on New York City history. So taking a walk with my father, he knew all the anecdotal histories of the buildings, not the architect necessarily, not the style, but he knew if there was a bordello, if there had been a murder, if there had been a celebrity living there. He knew all the human stories behind the facades, and that humanized the architecture for me. And my mother, on the other hand, who died when I was very young, lived long enough to see my interest in art really blossom, even as a child, and wrote in my baby book about it. She would hang everything I drew on the refrigerator, you know. So the reinforcement of my mother's in terms of my creativity very early and my father's love of architecture kind of make perfect sense. So that's I identify with the emotional stories behind the architecture. That's really what I try to paint. It's not just about representing the textures and colors of a building. It's about encapsulating the sense of time and lives spent moving through them. So
Absolutely. You totally capture my sentimentality and nostalgia for the city, and it's heartwarming. And I think your artwork is very photorealistic. So it's greatly appreciated as a New Yorker, of course.
well, one of the things, one of the series I've been working on since 2008 is Coney Island. And what started happening, I went there as a child and took my kids there when they were very small. So I have this kind of chain of experience of going there. And it also is a place that connects to my childhood. So I went back there when Astroland was threatened with being torn down, which was the amusement park I grew up with. I went there and I started a series. So I've been painting Coney Island on and off regularly for the last 12 or 13 years. So, and that, you know, so when you talk about nostalgia in New York, you know, what I try and paint is not just nostalgia for something that has passed, but also the connection to something that's ongoing. So there's a living nostalgia in those places. It's not just a turning back, but it's a connection too.
I think something that's really fascinating about your work is that you've painted the same settings throughout the years. You know, you'll revisit a subject several times, and you can really capture the passage of time and see how the neighborhood has changed, how certain institutions have gone away, how the neighborhood has maybe been gentrified. And I think that's a really interesting element of your work.
Yeah, well, you know, I was actually talking to an artist friend of mine, a very good painter, Bennett Badenese is his name, also does cityscapes. He lives in Baltimore, so he does old Baltimore. But he was doing an outdoor painting class down by Gainsford Street. And I passed by on my bike, and he said, "Hey, haven't you painted this area?" And I said, "Have I painted this area?" I painted it like 20 times over the last 40 years. But I have not painted it in the last 15 years. And the reason is because I do not like the High Line. I know I'm going to get shouted down on that, but I do not like the High Line. I do not like the Whitney Building. I loved Gainsford Street when the square was open, before the Hotel Gainsford, before Pastis, when it was a really almost a dangerous nocturnal area, you know, that had, there was a famous bistro, Florent, that was on Gainsford Street. That was a great place because it was 24/7, and Florent ran it. And at 2 a.m, you would have firemen and cops next to transvestites having steak frites. And to me, that was New York, you know. So that's when I painted it. So when it got gentrified, when the models came in, and then, you know, the models come in and the stores come in, then the celebrities follow, then the tourists come and the celebrities leave, and then the models leave. And then now, so what you have down there is largely very expensive restaurants, mostly filled with tourists, and multi-million-dollar condos surrounding the High Line. So that demographic is not what I paint.
It's interesting to me that you've deemed Gainsford, you know, no longer of interest to you. So I'm wondering, when you're biking around taking photos of Manhattan, what kind of things do speak to you?
You know what? As when I go to Europe, actually, if you're interested in kind of my MO, my modus operandi, is there was a great, probably one of the greatest artists of Paris is Eugene Auger. Now, Eugene Auger, A-T-G-E-T, is not a painter. He was a photographer. And I think his work is among the greatest artwork of Paris I've ever seen. He would go out at 5 a.m. at first light in Paris when the streets were empty with his big box camera, set it up and do these long exposures of the empty streets. They're fantastically beautiful. So I actually was inspired by that working method. So I started riding my bike at 5 a.m, taking photographs and sketching when the streets are empty. And it's really a trip to ride down the center of Fifth Avenue at 5 a.m. on a Sunday, right down the center of the avenue. There's not a soul in sight. So it's you know, it's a very beautiful way of kind of letting the architecture speak to you without the crowds.
There's something about the lighting in that hour that makes for good photography.
Yeah, it is. Well, you know, one of the things I tell my students is that everybody sees a beautiful sunny day and they say, "Oh man, I got to go take photographs." And the thing about photography, why photography can never really teach you a lot of what you need to know about painting, is that photography eliminates middle tones. If you have a very sunny day, the photographic lens takes its reading from the lightest part in the lens, which is usually the sky. And on a very bright sunny day, it opens up wide. And so the shadows go black. And so you see on sunny days, you get very little information into shadows. You know, that look, or those cookie cutter black shadows that a lot of photorealism has. So I always tell my students, if you want information about the buildings, take photographs on overcast days or on early or late hours when there's not direct sunlight. That way you see all the details of the building. So if you look at a lot of my facades, particularly when I do, a close-up of a building's windows and doorways, I almost always elect to do that in overcast light. And the reason being is then the shadows don't become this very strong formal pattern. What you see then is the spirit of the architecture, and rather than the formal design of shadows and highlights. So my work is more concerned with the emotional quality of the architecture and less necessarily about the formal quality of it, if that makes sense.
Right. And I think just, old buildings have a stronger emotional quality.
Oh yeah. Listen, benign neglect is one of my favorite words. Old buildings that haven't been renovated, the landlord kind of just left them and they show their age. So, but that becomes harder and harder to ferret out in our Manhattan. One of the things I was going to say to you earlier, I'm old enough at this point to have seen the city evolve dramatically from when I was first painting. I mean, paintings I did 30 years ago, there are streets that are absolutely unrecognizable now. And I never foresaw that I was recording a moment that would be gone. I just was trying to do a good painting. But, if New York evolves so quickly, I always say 100 years in New York is like 1,000 years in Rome. You talk to your 80-year-old great aunt now, and she'll tell you how the world has passed me by. I don't recognize anything anymore. And yeah, I'm actually living enough to feel like, feel now I know what they were talking about. I thought they were just getting, a little soft in the head, but now I realize the world shifts around them. And it shifts around us. When you look
at a painting from the 80s or the 90s, does it make you yearn for an earlier time?
Well, I'll tell you, there was a trade-off. How would you like to have you as a young guy, how would you like to have a studio apartment on West End Avenue and 78th Street for $157 a month?
I would love that.
That's when I was 17. That was my first apartment. And so I worked part-time at night at a restaurant and made $4 an hour. And it was enough money for me to pay my rent. I had 3 bills. I had a phone bill, a Con Ed bill, and that rent. It was $200 a month to live.
So 17, you were fresh out of high school, and then you got an apartment, and you were living alone.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what you were studying where for undergrad?
Undergrad, I went to CCNY.
For art?
Yeah.
So yeah, it reminds me because you were talking about how your mother recognized you were an artist at such a young age. They recognized that spark in you, and I guess it's always were encouraging for you to take that path.
I think the most important thing is the encouragement. I think that we all have little sparks in us, and I was not blessed with the greatest degree of talent, but I was very focused on it. And at music and art, I went to music and art in kind of a golden age. It was a smaller school. It was independent from performing arts. They've merged since then. The new Fielder LOH LaGuardia School is a merging of both those schools. But when I went there, it was on 135th Street and Convent in a Gothic building. And it was a much smaller school, and it was also incredibly hard to get into. From my junior high school, only 2 kids made the art program. Wow. So So it was special when you went there. And so suddenly at 14 years old, I had 3 periods of art every day. So I was introduced in my teenage years to oil painting, sculpture, printmaking, photography, which gave me a foundation, which was great. But I will say that there were a lot of kids in the school at that point who could draw their asses off, and I was still drawing Spider-Man.
It must have been a competitive environment.
Oh yeah, it was. Well, that was also like the hippie times. So it was like also who was coolest. I had a suede fringe jacket, and brown hair down to here. We all had that look back then. So yeah, we were, and that was an age that, so the competition back then was not academic. That was an age when nobody was thinking about making money. Everybody was thinking about realizing their artistic expression. So it was actually who was the most creative, who was doing the most interesting work that was the coolest, not who was going to make the most money.
And you went to that school at how old?
From 14 to 17.
14, that reminds me, I know you've told this story before, but I have to ask you about it. You're 14 in Central Park and you see Jimi Hendrix. Is this right?
Yeah. No, Jimi used to come by the Art Students League also.
He'd pick
up like 3 models.
So he was a superstar at that point.
Oh my God, he had already done Monterey Pop.
Right.
When I was 13, he did Monterey Pop. That was his first big US, great story that I still love about Monterey Pop. Hendrix became famous in England with the Jimi Hendrix Experience. And then he came back. He was born in Seattle, of course, went to England, got famous, came back to the States, and Monterey Pop is his first major US stop. And 1967, and he gets on the stage and people had never seen him perform. And he tears it up. He does things nobody's ever, he lights his guitar on fire at the end. So the act that follow him, so watching from the sidelines are the mamas and papas. They had to go on after him.
Oof.
And they were a soft like folk music group.
Mm-hmm.
They said it was the worst experience of their lives. They watched Hendrix tear up the crowd, and then they go out and they're singing their folk songs.
Right.
And they said, never follow Jimi Hendrix. If you're a performer, you can open for him, but you don't want to go on after.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to do California Dreamin' after that.
No. Not after he just did Foxy Lady. So, yeah, I would hang out at the fountain. The hippie center of Central Park in 1968 was a fountain. So I would hang out there and we played Frisbee, we smoked grass, and Jimi was walking by and we had a big bone going. And Jimi we see him, say, hey, Jimi, you want to take a hit? He said, hey, baby, everything's beautiful. Comes over, took a few hit with us and walked away. And that was it. But yeah, that's, all my young students, they don't want to hear about me talking about like Turner. They'd rather hear me talking about smoking a J with Jimi.
And that's quintessential New York. I mean, that's just amazing.
Well, listen, you don't have those experiences in Ohio, unfortunately.
No, you don't. So that was 14. And then there's another period of your life I'm very intrigued by. You're 18 and you decide to go abroad to Amsterdam.
Yeah.
And it sounds to me like this trip was a real turning point for you, in that you decided that you were going to dedicate your life really to honing this craft, getting your work shown in galleries. Tell me more about that trip and what spoke to you about the Dutch paintings you saw there.
Well, at 18 back then, I mean, my daughter spent a semester in Amsterdam as part of her undergraduate experience, as is a common experience for most kids now. A semester abroad is not unusual, right?
Right.
back then, when I was 18, nobody had gone to Europe. I mean, no 18-year-olds were going to Europe. I wanted to be an aesthete. I already thought, I wanted to see Paris. And my friends had told me, of course, Amsterdam, they had told me, was this haven of sex and drugs. And I was 18. So all my friends were buying jalopies and heading west. That was road trip, Grand Canyon. I had no interest in seeing the Midwest. I mean, I just didn't. I was already looking at some European art, going to some museums here, and I wanted to go and experience Europe. So I went. That was my first trip over, and you could go by Iceland Air was the cheapest way back then. Icelandic. You'd fly to Reykjavik, and then over to Luxembourg. You had to go to Luxembourg, and then you take a train wherever you wanted to go. So that's how I got over there. And, going to Amsterdam the first time, of course I was partaking, but, the Amsterdam had a magical moment for me, which is that going to the Rijksmuseum, I could wax rhapsodically about Dutch painting for hours. I mean, my first love in great painting were the Dutch. So I get to Amsterdam and I go to the Rijksmuseum, and the Dutch invented cityscape painting. They later taught it to the Venetians, people like Canaletto later on. But the Venetians were taught cityscape painting by the Dutch. The Dutch invented it in the 1600s in Amsterdam. There were other towns too, Utrecht and Haarlem, of course, but it was really in Amsterdam where this whole coterie of great cityscape painters lived and worked. And you go to the Rijksmuseum and you see these incredibly beautiful, inviting paintings. And then you walk out into the streets, into the paintings. The streets are still there. And so you look at the paintings in the museum, and then you leave the museum and you walk into the paintings. And that to me was such a trip. You really never left those cityscapes where, you saw them there and then you walked into them. So that was very magical for me. And the thing about Dutch art, is Baroque painting, which really focuses on light, technique, representation of form, texture, great painters of light. And yet these master painters never look down on you. They are not teaching you a lesson. They do tavern scenes with people drinking and dogs fucking. And, they say, I'm just one of you, come on in. They are completely accessible. They're great painters who never look down on you. And I found the accessibility of Dutch art is still something that, I want my work to be accessible. I don't want it to be something that you have to have a PhD to appreciate. So Dutch painting, the great thing about it is you do not have to be an intellectual to fall in love with it. And I always admired the egalitarian spirit in Dutch art.
So then you return home from Amsterdam, and you now decided, right, that you're going to go all in on painting, that you're going to make a career out of this.
After that, I said, look, I'll never be Vermeer. I'll never be, even some of the lesser guys there. But I said, see, one of the things, I don't know if you're familiar with Dutch 17th century art, but there are the grand masters. There's the Rembrandts, right? In Flanders, there's Rubens, there's Vermeer. And then there's everybody else. And everybody else, so the term Little Dutch Masters refers to all these great artists who took a little side way of working. Church interiors, portraits, still life, and mastered a certain thing, a particular thing. And they're as good as Rembrandt. And they're as good as Vermeer, but they're more specific. And they don't have the universal subject that those artists could do. So I recognized early that I was not going to be a Rembrandt or a Caravaggio. I knew I didn't have that breadth of interest and talent. But I said, what the little Dutch masters teach you is maybe I could take something that's my own and push it and hone it to a point of excellence. After graduate school from my generation, that's when your apprenticeship really began. That's when friends of mine, not just me, but serious artist friends, started thinking about going to Europe, started thinking about going to the museums, gave ourselves, we basically, the time division was we spent probably 50% of our time in the studio, 50% of our time working, menial jobs to pay for things, but they could pay for things back then. So we were in the studio half our time. The kids now coming out of school are roughly in the studio maybe 20% of their time. When I was developing my watercolor technique, there was nobody to teach it. No one was teaching that classic transparent watercolor technique then, virtually no one. So I had to learn it by going to museums and looking at 19th century watercolor paintings and figuring out how they were done, trial and error. So I would go to all these little museums and have them take out their watercolors. And I would be sitting there and saying, like, what the hell did he do first? What did they do second? What's the third color they put down? Was this wet and wet? Was this wet on dry? And I figured out, I independently, over time, developed the technique I use. Nobody taught it to me. But I wish I could have saved probably 10 or 15 years of trial and error if I had had a teacher who could have shown me some of these techniques. I had to figure them out. And now I teach them. So, one of the advantages of for some of my students, ideally you want to become the kind of teacher you wish you could have had. I think that's the ultimate model for teachers, to say, so I try and I can teach somebody the nuts and bolts of drawing and painting. I can't teach somebody poetry or make them an artist, but I can teach them the tools that they can then become their own artists through using.
So you feel like someone can will themselves into becoming a great artist. I mean, what I've taken away from that is that you have to put in your 10,000 hours.
Yeah, well, that's great that you feel that way. 10,000 hours is 20 hours a week for 10 years. It's exactly what it turns out to be. And I have students, I don't mind name dropping. Howard Stern is one of my favorite students. Howard's been with me 7 years, and my man has a foundation of drawing and painting that now he can really do his own thing. He's just evolving after these 7 years to become his own artist. He's really been flowering as somebody who's now doing his own thing. And it took him 7 years of looking at the artists I recommend and practicing the drawing techniques I teach and the wash techniques. There's a lot to learn.
Yeah.
But if somebody's willing to put in the time, the beautiful thing about it is it's a learnable technique.
I was going to mention, Howard, actually, funny enough, I was doing some, research for this conversation last night. And I had Howard on in the background, and all of a sudden he's talking about Frederick Brosen. And he tells a story, which I'd like to get your take on, that I guess over the weekend or just recently, he was speaking with you and he was tantruming because he couldn't find bowls he uses to mix watercolors. Is this it, right? Did that just happen?
He was freaking out. Well, he's on, listen, the guy, has an enormous career, right? I mean, not a big career. He has like a Jagunda career. And the guests he has on, I mean, how do you think I feel when, the day before he comes on Zoom with me, he's just spent 4 hours with Paul McCartney. Yeah. I say, Howard, you just took a big step down, my man. That first step is a Lulu. Of everybody, I tell him, of everybody he knows, everyone, Paul McCartney would be the one I'd want to meet. Sir Paul would be my number one, a living Mozart.
Agreed. What's your favorite Beatles record?
Oh my God. The Beatles, I like into Van Gogh. Van Gogh's first brown potato eater painting and his last paintings in oil, 10 years. Mm-hmm. The entire evolution, the amazing evolution of Van Gogh is 10 years. The whole package. Beatles music, not their solo careers, the Beatles music, 10 years.
Right.
Look where they took us. They went from like boy pop to acoustic to psychedelic to, look at the jump from, what do you even want to say? Rubber Soul to Sgt. Pepper's. They go from this acoustic melodic band. Sgt. Pepper's blew everybody's mind. 1967, they brought in sounds and orchestral stuff and, playing tapes backwards. They started fucking around with the medium like nobody had ever even thought of. And, I was 13 and I'm listening to that. And, I'm so glad I grew up with the Beatles because they were really brilliant cultural mentors, in terms of expressing yourself, in terms of creative growth. And you just look at, that's the beauty of the Beatles, is the evolution of their work. It's astounding,
Yeah, and I think they're so inspiring, just to any creatives to reinvent yourself in that way and to innovate. And
they were kids,
right?
They were fucking kids. George Harrison's 19 years old. Come on. And somehow it's like the stars align. And somehow the combination of their talents and the time and the opportunity created something unique. These constellations happen. They happen in art, they happen in music, they happen in writing, where just a combination of circumstance, genetics, culture, I don't know. But whatever it is, the Beatles songbook is going to be here if we're here. Mm-hmm. If we don't flood the fucking planet, I'm worried about not you, your grandkids or your kids are going to be drowning. If we're able to somehow extricate ourselves from this fate, Beatles music will be something that survives. It'll be floating on top.
It's funny, Let It Be was a top 10 album this week. It just never ends.
It never ends. Never. Oh, listen, my kids, my daughter knows it like every Beatles song because I would have it playing in my studio her whole childhood. I listened to other things too, obviously, but the Beatles were prominent.
So what is your favorite album? Do you have one that we could get you on record about?
Oh, Jesus. Maybe, God, I love them. I loved, the Beatles, like for a lot of us, different albums reflect different moments in our lives. So I remember singing along to, Meet the Beatles on a Victrola, like a stand-up record player, and putting the record on and the needle on it. And then the speaker was in the front, little speaker, and listening to it. And, and singing along with it. I was 11 years old and singing along with the Beatles. So that was, my introduction to loving music. And then, I remember being 13 and Sgt. Pepper's blew our minds, man. We said, like, what the fuck is this? Where did this come from? And then maybe the greatest musically, though, might be Abbey Road. Abbey Road, that the second side, that continuous, the way they made it a continuous, that, and it just takes you so many places. Howard absolutely thinks the Beatles are head and shoulders the greatest rock band ever. He digs the Stones. He had Mick Jagger on the other week, but he says musically, they're the Titans. Sir Paul is the man. I mean, I don't think there's a musician alive who wouldn't, be deferential in front of Sir Paul.
Have you got a chance to see Paul McCartney live ever?
No, never got to see Paul live. I keep telling Howard, come on, Howard, we've been friends for 7 years. Next time you have lunch with Paul, can't you give me a shout out? Can't you have me pop by?
That would be incredible.
Are you kidding? My daughter is a baker my daughter bakes for Danny Myers. She's part of his catering division.
I've seen some of her work. She is so talented. I mean, obviously she's inherited your artistic genes.
I wouldn't go that far, but she's gotten some of my talent. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
She does very beautiful. I mean, her tarts are outrageous. I bring her up because she cooked 2,000 desserts this week for an event that Paul McCartney was the main speaker.
And she said, you in?
Oh man, I said, come on. No, she texts me when he's speaking. So it's too late. And she said, Springsteen's here too. And I said, look, I love Springsteen, but I'm sorry. I'll take Paul.
Me too.
No insult to Springsteen's greatness.
So you did witness this stern freak out over the mixing bowls recently.
Well, Howard is under a lot of pressure. He's working on a huge painting, the biggest one he's done.
Mm-hmm.
And it's taken him months. And he's doing a beautiful job on it, but he feels pressured because he doesn't have enough time, aside from the radio, to put in the kind of hours he wishes he could. So he loves the painting so much that he's feeling frustrated. I've reluctantly had him work on bigger things because they demand much more kind of prolonged engagement. So working on smaller things is more manageable for somebody like him, who has to divide his time so strictly. But he wanted to take on this big boy, and he's doing it beautifully, but he's frustrated that he can't work on it. So at the end of our session, he's mixing colors. And what I do with him is I won't see him for a number of days. So I'll go over what his next step should be and some of the colors he should be using. And he'll even pre-mix some so that he's prepared. So we're going over this mixing, and he looks down and he doesn't have a bowl. And he freaks out. Where the fuck are my bowls? God damn it, the housekeeper must have come in and taken them. He's like wigging out. And then he finally realizes that he just had a package of 6 out, and he has more bowls in a box somewhere. So he was like, okay, I don't have to fire her. Everything's fine. He calmed down. But yeah, he went off. My cousin told me that he said some nice things about me.
He did. He said that you were the man that taught him everything he knows about painting. I believe those were his
exact
words. Yep.
That's very nice that he says that.
Yeah. And, I think I first discovered your work over the summer. I spent some time out in the Hamptons, and there's this local magazine in the East End called Dan's Paper. And Howard had a painting featured on the cover. Unbelievable work. So impressive. And included a little interview as well. And he said, something with a similar sentiment, that you really taught him everything.
And then you looked me up based on that?
Yeah.
And that's how you found my work?
That's how I found your work.
Well, I have to tell him. that, you know, it's finally paid off. No, he's, you know, Howard is exactly 3 weeks older than me. He had his assistant look up watercolorists in his area. And she found several, and he looked at their work and he liked mine the best. So he called me up and he brought his assistant over with him to kind of vet me, to see that I wasn't like dangerous or crazy. Right. So he comes over and he did 6 days in a row with me, six-hour days. And that was going to be it. And at the end of the 6 days, he says, I want to continue. So that started twice a week for the last 7 years.
And I guess, you know, immediately you probably recognized how serious he would be taking this.
No. He just wanted to be able, he had taken some calligraphy courses and a few local courses with artists in the Hamptons. Mm-hmm. But, you know, the problem, this is one of the things that is still, it's still interesting. Watercolor is still, you know, a poor cousin to oil painting in terms of public awareness. You know, one of the things that happened, it evolved over, watercolor takes less materials, they're less toxic, it's an easier setup, it's for a hobbyist, it's much more accessible. So, you know, really developing in England out of the 19th century, watercolor became like everybody and their aunt did little watercolors of the garden in England. They sold these little sets. So watercolor became an amateur medium and became a lightweight medium. Became, you know, you've seen all the washy flower paintings and all of that watercolor kind of descended into for a long time. So one of the things I wanted to do is studying the early English watercolorists like Turner. There's a whole school of them. There's Bonington, Turner, Cotman, maybe the best watercolorists I've ever seen. And those are who I studied for technique. Their work, Turner, you know, his work eventually dissolves. I mean, he becomes almost abstract. But Turner's early work is very beautiful, precise architectural drawings with transparent washes laid over them. That was the technique. And that's what I learned from them. So I wanted to do watercolors that were more serious, were more graphic, were more developed. I saw the potential in the medium for it to be really a serious medium for an ambitious painter. Not a dilettante's medium, but something that could be applied in a way that would have, you know, real gravitas. So that was, I was young and ambitious. I wanted to kind of bring a seriousness and a weight to watercolor painting that I hadn't seen.
Were any of your peers working with watercolors?
No, not really. There were a few. There's a still life painter named John Stuart Ingle, who was working in the 90s, who is largely forgotten now, but was did life-size still lifes, very precise watercolors, and a great technician. Carolyn Brady is another one, Joseph Raphael. So there's just a handful of artists, really ambitious, really highly skilled artists who are using watercolor as their primary medium. And as I said before, because I've developed my technique not based on anybody else's really, right? My work doesn't look like Hopper or Sargent or Wyeth so whether you like my work or not, whether you agree with it or not, it doesn't look like anybody else's work. It's not derivative. So the artist, there's a lot of derivative watercolor work. Watercolor lends itself to a formulaic treatment. You're never going to be a great artist using a derivative technique. You know, your technique evolves to uniquely express what you have to say. For me, technique and message are the same thing. The way you paint and what you paint have to have a synchronicity to them. right? What you want to do is gain the tools and then find what you have to uniquely say with them. And then you're an artist.
I love this idea that you kind of recognize that there was an opportunity to redefine watercoloring as a medium and to have it be taken more seriously. That's so interesting to me.
Well, it's also youthful arrogance. I mean, we all, when we're in our 30s, we all think we can change the world, right? And then you learn that there are a lot of forces at work in the world that you have no control over. Things like economics, like cultural trends, like fashion. You know, there's a lot of, right now, for instance, in the 90s and into the aughts, realism was fashionable. So my kind of work, the kind of work a lot of my friends do, was selling really well. You know, I had a great run. Now that's not the case. The galleries, realism is not trending now. Pop art, outsider art, and 40s and 50s abstraction is now what is being taken to the major art fairs, is being auctioned at the houses, you know, of contemporary art. So we're in a period now where we had kind of a little golden age of realism in the 90s and early aughts. Of course, I'm hoping it'll come back. And of course, a real artist stays true to their mission. I'm not going to change my style because trends change. But it's been hard for a lot of artists. I mean, a lot of very, very accomplished artists. We have to teach more. I'm doing, I think, the best work I've ever done, you know, but it's right now, it is not getting the same kind of attention it did 15 years ago.
If you were to look in the Frederick Brosen archives, is there anything that is so markedly different from what you've always done? Is there anything that I would say, there's no way this is Frederick's?
You mean my S&M series?
Maybe.
No, I'm kidding. No, I'm you know, as I said, one of the things, it took me many, many years to refine my technique. I mean, I did a lot of bad painting for a lot of years. I did a lot of, you know, I'm actually working on a painting right now of Bethesda Fountain that I painted a very, very similar view 25 years ago exactly. And I've looked very carefully at that painting to say to myself, I want to see what I've learned in 25 years. And all the differences are subtle, but because 25 years ago, I still could set up a perspective and get all the lines right? And I knew I could get the shadows right, but my sophistication in interpreting form, my knowledge of sky forms, of tree forms, of architecture, of statuary, of the movement of reflective light. These are all things that I have deepened and refined over many years. So a casual or somebody who's not that schooled in art would probably look at both paintings and think, not be able to see that profound a difference. But I can see a profound difference in my work, in the depth, you know, as we started this session, really what I want to paint is not the actual building, but the cumulative kind of feeling of a timelessness that the building represents, right? And working towards that spirit, getting closer and closer to being able to communicate that feeling is what the refinement of my work has tried to be about, right? So I've tried to make the work more expressive and less superficial as time has gone by. And I hope I've done that well, but I'm somebody who, by the time I was out of graduate school, had a technique and had a subject matter, and have really spent the last 40 years deepening and refining that original commitment. So I'm not somebody like Van Gogh. I would never even breathe that word, but you know, my work does not involve the evolution in terms of subject and technique that an artist like that does. and I admire it greatly. But there are many other artists who took a single thing, as I've said before, and deepened it and honed it. And, the subject of cityscape that I paint is so broad and so wide, and there's so much you can do that I think it's inexhaustible. So people ask me, Mr. Brosen, have you ever done an abstract? And no, I haven't. I love what I do. So I hope that it's not just ritual. I hope that, the answer is when I get up in the morning and I lift the glassine sheet and I'm in the middle of a painting that I'm enjoying, I love it. And I feel turned on, and I feel engaged, and I feel completely in tune with what I'm doing. And that kind of Zen-like experience in creating art, man, being able to make something beautiful, that's a wonderful thing to be able to do. So, that's good enough. I mean, there are a lot of things you can do with your life. Trying to create something beautiful ain't a bad choice.
I probably kept you too long, but Frederick, I'd love to just pull up quickly two of your works that really moved me, and just maybe talk to you about some of the particulars involved. I mean, I'm not much of an artist myself, and I couldn't really maybe articulate some of the techniques I'm seeing, but if we could look over a couple things, I think that would be really interesting. So we're looking at your 2019 painting, Broadway and Grand Street.
Right. That's what I call a big boy.
How big is it?
It's 30 by 50.
Wow. Something that really stands out to me about this one is the fact that the street is wet. I mean, when you have a puddle like this, and then you're trying to capture the reflection, and you have the headlights over here glistening. I mean, is that a more painstaking element of this painting, or it's just as difficult as anything else?
Well, listen, I believe to do anything well, I mean, as the great Dutch philosopher Spinoza said, all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. Anything excellent is very difficult. A simple still life, a beautiful simple still life, a Morandi still life, very difficult thing to do. A portrait head. So something like this involves, you've got to get past the particulars. What you're trying to create is the overall sense of mood, the movement of light. The big movement of light is what you're looking for. And that's that radiating light from the pinpoint of the central perspective as it radiates outward. And everything you do should contribute to reinforcing the movement of that light. So that's the biggest thing you're looking at. And there are many ways you do it. Like the darkening, if you look, the corners darken. Right. So even early in the painting process, I'm laying down washes that create almost a horseshoe of darkening so that the bowl of light is pushed to the center of the painting. So there are all these undertones, big wet and wet washes that precede the details that direct your eye into that light in the distance. And then it's a matter of everything is about matching up. Well, first of all, a painting can never be better than the drawing that it starts with, in my opinion. So being able to lay those forms, so, getting the edges of those puddles drawn so they lay flat. And then really looking at the difference between what is the color of the asphalt and the color of the reflected sky in the puddle. And identifying that and laying those in early as separate tones. And then, seeing that you're picking up a little bit of reflection. You know what is the anchor of this painting?
What's that?
I think it's the best street lamp I ever painted. Dead in the center. I love that street lamp. That street lamp has decals on it and signs and lights and you know, it has all sorts of stuff on it.
Incredible.
And it serves as this stick right in the middle of the painting that bisects the painting, that you kind of see everything else against. And if you look, the vertical of that lamppost continues down into the reflection. So it creates this thread that divides the entire painting. So it's against that you can see the movement of the space going behind it. So if you take out that lamppost, and the reflection of it, it's a very different painting.
And is this a scene that was taken early in the morning on one of your 5 a.m. bike rides?
Yeah, this is early in the morning, and it was after. I'm not sure if it was. I took photographs for it after the morning after Dorota? Hurricane Irene. There was nobody on the street. And this area, by the way, this is Lower Broadway. You know, that's the Culinary Institute. My daughter went to cooking school there, where the blue flags are.
Right.
That area is thronging. That's where all those shops are. You can see Daphne's was there. And you have trucks unloading. I mean, you never get to see this strip bare. And that morning I got out there, and it was a unique opportunity to see the openness of this broad street with all the reflective wetness on it. I don't think you could replicate that photograph now, no matter when you went there.
How do you determine where to crop this? How much building to include? Where the street begins?
That's a hard question. I usually wind up. This was actually done. I had a great photo for this. I had one photo that I based this on. One really great photo of maybe 100 I took that day. But for most of my paintings, I don't have that great a single source. Most of my paintings are done from multiple sources, from photos taken over different. I have one street in Paris I've painted that the painting was done from a series of photographs taken over 20 years.
Wow. So it's like a composite.
Yeah, I do composites. This one just happened to be one of these. Once in a while, I get a photograph that it's already made. I say it's a painting waiting to be painted. But that's rare. So this was actually done from a single source. I eliminated stuff. There were other cars. There were other figures. I tend to simplify in that way.
Let me show you one other one I have here.
Sure.
This is 72nd Street from, I believe, 2013. Yeah, it says 2013.
Yeah.
What time of day was this one?
That was twilight. That was 6:03.
Oh, there he is, 6:03.
How do I know that? How could I figure that out? And this is a huge piece. This is like, I think 54 by 32, something like that. It's a big piece. And it took me months. I've painted 72nd Street at least half a dozen times, big paintings of this exact juncture, because you have the great Ansonia Hotel, where Babe Ruth and Arturo Toscanini stayed, yeah. And you have the Heinz and Lafarge, 1905, 72nd Street subway kiosk in the center. And then you have the Central Savings Bank building in the middle. That's modeled after the Pitti Palace in Florence, 1923, I think. So this was always the quintessential Upper West Side view to me. This was like, I know many people feel like Lincoln Center is kind of the start, or even Time Warner Center, the start of the Upper West Side. But growing up for me, 72nd Street was the start of the Upper West Side I knew. So this was kind of the gateway. You have the straight take up Amsterdam, and you have Broadway going off to the left. And you have this conglomeration of these classic buildings. They're different styles, different periods. You have, I think the Ansonia is the 1880s. Heinz and Lafarge subway kiosk is 1905. Central Savings Bank is the 1920s. but they're beautiful. You know, they're classic, beautiful buildings, and the whole composition of this, the depth of it. Again, it's something I painted. I did this as a commission because a couple who commissioned it lived on 71st Street when they were first married. And so this was their view. They'd come out of their building and this is what they'd see. So this is the last of a series of maybe 6 paintings of this view I've done. I wouldn't be opposed to doing it once more.
The glow of these lanterns, it really gets me.
Yeah, I love
the kiosk is lit.
Well, there's an artist, you know, one of the things, I have a fairly large art book collection. And what I use all those artists for are mentors. So certain artists paint certain things beautifully. So if I have a problem in a painting, if I have a challenge in a painting, I'll try and think of what artist can I think of that I could refer to for help. And there's an artist, Grimshaw, John Atkinson Grimshaw, who was a neighbor of Whistler's, actually, who mastered painting wet streets at night. He was like the greatest. He could only do that. It was like his one thing. But he did it. Whistler loved it. Whistler based his nocturnes on Grimshaw's work. Grimshaw was not as good an artist as Whistler, but he did this one thing really beautifully. So one of the things that Grimshaw taught me, when you have the light in the sky determines the light on the ground. The sky plane and the ground plane are reflective of one another. This ground plane is a blanket that reflects the light in the sky. So many artists make their ground plane too dark. They don't account enough for the reflective light that the ground plane picks up from the sky. So basically, the way I look at landscape for all the detail, for all of that is you have your sky plane and your ground plane, which are interrelated. They reflect one another. And then you have your verticals, which are almost always darker. You have your dark verticals inserted between those two planes. And that is a very big, simple way of looking at how light moves in a landscape.
I'm just looking at this and thinking to myself, if I were to even attempt something like this, you'd have buildings leaning over and be a mess. I mean, is there a mathematical aspect to your planning of these paintings?
Well, you know, what it is really is artists have a lot of choices in terms of perspective now. Before the camera, like before 1839, artists all use what's called ideal perspective in architectural rendering, which means all your verticals were parallel. There were no accounting for the orthogonal planes up and down. Artists were unaware of it. So all cityscape painting before the 1840s, all the verticals are parallel. And that's not the way we see. Toward the edge of our vision, things bend up and down. So now artists know that. And the camera lens, once the camera lens came out, artists noticed the bend up and down of forms. They're straight in the middle, and as they go outward, they bend. So now you have artists. So, I mean, it translates, a 55 millimeter lens translates to the way we see. So if somebody wants to take a photograph that mimics our vision most closely, they use that lens. Anything else, you can do a fisheye lens, which bends it more, or you can do a zoom lens, which bends it less. So you have artists, like there's an artist, Rackstraw Downs, great painter, who does cityscapes, but his verticals go crazy. He bends them, he exaggerates them. I do something where I don't use exactly ideal perspective. I don't make all my verticals parallel, but I bend them just a little bit at the edges. You'll see like the Ansonia's leaning in just a little bit. And the buildings on the right side of Amsterdam are bending in a little bit. So that's really the only, and then I set up a perspective. I pick a couple a painting like this has only maybe 3 or 4 perspective points in it. And those are easy to find. I mean, I do construct big boxes in perspective that I manipulate. And then once I feel like I've got the balance of all the boxes right, then I start drawing over.
It is fascinating. I could listen to you talk about the techniques of these paintings all day. I mean, really, I thank you.
Well, listen, I'm glad you appreciate it.
It's incredible.
Now that means you, me, and Howard Stern now appreciate it.
I want to tell the people what you've got going on. You know, you can check out frederickbrosen.com to see Frederick's artwork. You can also purchase prints on your site.
Right, and I'm on Instagram, right, at Frederick Brosen.
Frederick
and I have a
Brosen.
website, and I do some Zoom workshops. People can always, you know, through my email or my Instagram, get in touch if they're interested in my workshops. I teach private lessons. I mean, Howard Stern's not my only private student, but he's the only one people want to talk about.
Your workshops, is that for beginners and intermediates?
It's for everybody. Yeah, I do. What I do is when I do a weekend workshop, it's 2 days, and I do 1 day of just demos. I'll paint a little painting in front of people. And then the second day, if they're working on their own stuff, they can post stuff. I have a monitor, a Zoom person who organizes imagery so we can go through their paintings, and I can do critiques. I basically do 1 day of demos and 1 day of critiques. So then if people have their own drawings or watercolors, I'll critique them with the class.
And people can contact you by email if they're interested in these workshops?
Yeah, my monitor, if you go to my Instagram, you can either DM me or or on my website, my email. My email is on my website.
Okay, great. So again, that's frederickbrosen.com, at Frederick_Brosen on Instagram. Check out his site. You could buy some prints, sign up for his workshops. Is there anything else you want to tell the people?
I'll probably have another show in Provincetown next August. I had one this August. Herschel and Adler is the gallery that represents me in New York. Mm-hmm. If people are interested in seeing big paintings of mine, I'm not right now in an exhibition there, but if they go there, they're very nice. They'll always pull out a couple and show people.
Where is that?
I don't have a show date. They're in the Fuller Building at 41 East 57th Street on the 10th floor. They're very nice people. It's a great gallery, and they're very accommodating. People want to see work. And otherwise, right now, I don't have another show date in New York set. But, you know, my last show was in February 2020, and the pandemic closed it at the end of the show. So I'm in no rush for another big show right now. I've had several. I'm sure I'll set a date at some time, but yeah, right now, probably Provincetown or visiting my gallery would be the way to see my work.
Okay. Amazing.
All right. But it's been a pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time and being generous.
Yeah, stay in touch. Let me know what you're doing. What are you majoring in?
Marketing analytics.
Okay. Well, sell some paintings for me. No.
Gladly.
No, it's been a pleasure. Really.
Thanks again, Frederick.
Take care. Have a great Thanksgiving.
Likewise. Take care. Right.